Eugenics did not die. It just learned to speak more politely. We're often told that eugenics is a dark chapter of the past, something defeated, disgraced, and buried with the 20th century. It's a comforting story, isn't it? The idea that we collectively saw the error of our ways and moved on. But that story, as reassuring as it sounds, is incomplete. The truth is, eugenics didn't just vanish into thin air. It retreated, it went underground, changed its vocabulary, and put on a more respectable face. The core ideas, the ones that judge human worth based on genetics, found new ways to survive, often disguised in the language of science, health, and personal choice. So, what does this new eugenics look like, and how can we spot it today? Let's explore. Why should we care about eugenics? It's a dark chapter in history, right? Something from a long time ago. Well, not exactly. It's crucial to understand that eugenics wasn't some fringe, crackpot theory whispered in secret. It was mainstream. It was respectable. It was funded by major foundations and championed by some of the most prominent figures of the time. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a handful of extremists. This was an idea that permeated the very fabric of society. Scientists, celebrated intellectuals, and political leaders openly supported it. Prestigious universities like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton not only taught eugenics in their classrooms, they were hotbeds for its research and promotion. It was presented as cutting-edge science, the key to building a better, stronger, healthier society. Governments didn't just turn a blind eye, they actively enforced eugenic policies. Laws were passed, not just in Nazi Germany, but right here in the United States and across dozens of other countries. These laws led to the forced sterilization of tens of thousands of people, deemed unfit to have children. They were used to justify discriminatory immigration quotas, marriage restrictions, and the segregation of those considered genetically inferior. This was all done in the name of progress and public welfare. So, why does this matter today? Because ideas, especially powerful and persuasive ones, don't just vanish. They don't simply die out. They mutate, they evolve, they change their clothes and reappear in new forms, often disguised in the language of modern science, public health, or even social justice. The core belief of eugenics that we can and should control human reproduction to improve the population is a seductive one. It taps into our desire for perfection, for control, for a solution to complex social problems. And we see echoes of this thinking today. We see it in debates about genetic editing, in certain discussions around reproductive technologies, and sometimes even in the way we talk about intelligence, disability, and social worth. Understanding the history of eugenics is not about pointing fingers at the past. It's about recognizing a dangerous pattern of thought. It's about developing the critical thinking skills to identify when science is being used to justify prejudice, and when the promise of a better future is built on the devaluation of certain human lives. Because if we forget how icily mainstream society embraced this destructive idea once before, we risk failing to recognize it the next time it comes knocking. And it will come knocking. That's why this subject matters. Eugenics, it's a word that carries a heavy, dark weight today. But like many dangerous ideas, it didn't begin with a roar. It began with a whisper. It started quietly, cloaked in the language of concern, backed by statistics, and fueled by fear. Fear of what? Fear of societal decay, of a perceived decline in human quality. The word itself, eugenics, comes from Greek roots, meaning good birth or good origin. On the surface, it sounds harmless, doesn't it? Even noble. Who wouldn't want a better future for humanity? Who wouldn't want healthier, stronger, more intelligent generations to come? The premise was deceptively simple. Improve the human race by encouraging those with desirable traits to have more children, while discouraging or even preventing those with undesirable traits from reproducing at all. It was framed as a scientific solution to social problems, a way to apply the principles of animal breeding to people. The idea was to take control of our own evolution, to sculpt a better version of ourselves. But this simple premise held a catastrophic flaw, a question that would lead to unimaginable suffering. Who gets to decide? Who defines desirable? Who has the power to label an entire group of people unfit or undesirable? This was the central fatal problem. The power to define improvement became the power to devalue human life. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this power fell into the hands of influential scientists, politicians, and social reformers across the globe, from the United States to Great Britain to Scandinavia. They saw problems like poverty, crime, and mental illness not as complex social issues, but as genetic failings. Their solution wasn't to fix the system, but to fix the people, or rather, to eliminate the problem people. This wasn't some fringe ideology at first. It was mainstream. It was taught in universities, promoted at world fairs, and championed by public figures. They used charts and family trees, what they called pedigrees, to trace traits like feeble-mindedness or pauperism through generations, presenting them as irrefutable scientific proof. This seemingly objective data gave a veneer of legitimacy to deep-seated prejudices against the poor, immigrants, and racial minorities. The fear of being outbred by these so-called inferior groups was a powerful motivator, and eugenics provided the scientific justification for that fear. The idea of creating a better humanity is an old dream. But when that dream is built on the belief that some lives are worth more than others, it inevitably becomes a nightmare. The quiet, noble idea of good birth was about to become a loud, brutal reality for millions. Picture this. It's the late 19th century. The world is buzzing with new ideas. Biology is the exciting new kid on the block, and the study of genetics is just beginning to take shape. It's a time of immense optimism, but also a time where confidence often sprinted far ahead of actual evidence. Scientists, eager to make their mark, began to categorize everything including people. They started ranking individuals based on traits they deemed important: intelligence, health, even morality. It was an age of measurement, a time when numbers and data were seen as the ultimate arbiters of truth. This obsession with quantifying human worth quickly took a dark turn. Researchers armed with calipers and charts started gathering data. They measured skulls, tested reflexes, and administered rudimentary intelligence tests. But the problem wasn't just in the collecting of data, it was in the interpretation. They began to confuse correlation with causation. For example, if a certain group scored lower on a culturally biased test, it wasn't seen as a failure of the test, but as proof of that group's inherent inferiority. A person's circumstances, their opportunities, their background, all of these were ignored. Numbers were no longer just data points, they became destiny. A person's future was being written for them based on flawed science and societal prejudice. It was a slippery slope, and society was sliding down it fast, with the supposed authority of science leading the way. This misuse of scientific principles laid the groundwork for one of history's most chilling movements, eugenics. Initially, eugenics wasn't framed in the overtly racial terms we often associate with it today. It started by targeting those deemed unfit for other reasons. The poor, the disabled, people with mental health conditions, they were all labeled as drains on society. Proponents of eugenics argued that for humanity to progress, these undesirable traits needed to be eliminated from the gene pool. They used the language of public health and social improvement to justify their proposals. Then, race entered the equation. At first it was subtle, woven into discussions about immigration and national character. But soon, it became the central, deafening theme. The eugenics movement began to loudly champion the idea of a superior race, using pseudoscience to prove the inferiority of others. This wasn't presented as a hateful ideology. No, it was cleverly packaged as progress. It was sold as a way to build a more efficient, healthier, and more responsible society. They created a narrative where prejudice was not just acceptable, but a scientific necessity. But let's call it what it was: cruelty, meticulously documented and justified with paperwork and charts. It was a terrifying example of how easily science can be twisted to serve prejudice, turning a quest for knowledge into a weapon of oppression. The ideas of eugenics didn't just stay in academic journals, they seeped into public policy and law. Across the United States and Europe, governments passed laws inspired by eugenic principles. These included restrictive immigration policies designed to keep out undesirable ethnic groups. Marriage laws were enacted to prevent interracial unions. But the most horrifying manifestation was forced sterilization. Tens of thousands of people, often without their knowledge or consent, were sterilized by the state. The victims were disproportionately women, minorities, and those in psychiatric institutions. They were told it was for their own good, or for the good of society. It was a profound violation of human rights, all carried out under the banner of scientific progress. What's truly unsettling is how mainstream these ideas became. Leading intellectuals, politicians, and philanthropists openly supported eugenics. Fairs and exhibitions held fitter family contests, where families were judged like livestock. The movement had powerful backers and a sophisticated propaganda machine. This widespread acceptance created an environment where discriminatory and inhumane practices were not only tolerated but celebrated. It shows us a critical lesson. When science detaches itself from ethics and empathy, it can become a powerful tool for injustice. The legacy of eugenics serves as a stark and painful reminder of the catastrophic consequences that arise When we judge human worth based on flawed metrics and deep-seated prejudice, it's a chapter of history we must never forget, to ensure we never repeat it. The theories we've been discussing weren't just academic exercises, they seeped into the halls of power, and soon, laws followed. Quietly at first, then with chilling legal authority, governments began to take control. Sterilization programs were launched in multiple countries. These weren't isolated incidents. We're talking about tens of thousands of people, sterilized without their consent, with no legal recourse, no way to appeal. The state decided who was unfit to reproduce. And this wasn't happening in some forgotten corner of the world. It was happening in developed nations, celebrated by some as a mark of progress. The targets were often the most vulnerable, the poor, the mentally ill people with disabilities, and ethnic minorities. They were labeled as burdens on society, and the solution, it was argued, was to simply stop them from having children. The idea that the state could and should intervene in the most personal of human decisions. The decision to have a family had taken root. It was a dark turn where scientific theory was twisted into a tool of social control, all under the guise of improving the human race. Then, things escalated. The ideology of eugenics was taken to its most horrific and logical conclusion. One regime in particular embraced it not just as a policy, but as a central pillar of its entire worldview. What had been a program of sterilization became a program of elimination. They didn't just want to prevent certain people from being born, they wanted to erase those already living. This was industrialized selection, industrialized death. The process was systematic, bureaucratic, and utterly ruthless. The criteria for who was deemed unworthy of life expanded dramatically, rooted in twisted notions of racial purity. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a state-sponsored atrocity on a scale the world had never seen. After the war, and the full revelation of these horrors, the word eugenics became toxic. It was synonymous with mass murder. But while the word was banished, the underlying thinking didn't just disappear overnight. The ideas that fueled this catastrophe, that some lives are more valuable than others, that humanity can be perfected by controlling who gets to exist, lingered in the shadows, waiting for a new name. After the war, a profound silence fell over the topic of eugenics. It wasn't debated. It was simply avoided. You'd think there would be a global reckoning, a deep and painful examination of how so many scientists, doctors, and politicians could have supported such a dangerous ideology. But that didn't happen. Instead, there was a collective forgetting. Institutions that had championed eugenics quietly rebranded themselves. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Institution, major funders of eugenics, research shifted their focus. Terminology was softened. Eugenics became human genetics or population studies. The goal was to distance themselves from the horrors of the recent past, without actually confronting their role in it. The people who had been sterilized were largely forgotten. Their stories were not told. There were no apologies, no reparations. It was a history that was actively suppressed because it implicated so many in the civilized Western world. The silence wasn't an absence of memory. It was a deliberate act of erasure. The dark chapter was closed, but the book was never truly read. Today the language has changed again. We don't hear the word eugenics in polite conversation. Instead, we hear new phrases that sound scientific, beneficial, and modern. We talk about genetic screening for potential diseases, about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, about optimizing our children. We discuss quality of life as a factor in making decisions about birth and death. The tools are undeniably more sophisticated. We're not using crude measurements of skulls. We're mapping the human genome. But listen closely. Does the logic feel familiar? The underlying questions are hauntingly similar to those asked a century ago. Who should be born? Who should not? And most importantly, who gets to decide? The debate has moved from the state capitol to the fertility clinic, from the politician's decree to the individual's choice. But it's a choice often shaped by societal pressure, economic anxieties, and a pervasive unspoken belief that we can, and perhaps should, engineer a better version of humanity. We are standing on a slippery slope, armed with technology our ancestors could only dream of, and we need to ask ourselves, have we truly learned the lessons of the past, or are we simply repeating it in a more modern disguise? Here's a hard truth. Technology always moves faster than our ethics. We're offered new tools, new procedures, new ways to shape our future, and they're always framed as a choice. But what is choice, really, when it's surrounded by pressure? Think about it. There's economic pressure, the pressure to have a child who won't require expensive lifelong care. There's social pressure, the desire to fit in, to have a child who meets certain societal standards. And then there's the immense weight of medical authority. where a doctor presents a test or a procedure not just as an option, but as the responsible thing to do. Suddenly, that simple choice isn't so simple anymore. The idea of genuine consent becomes incredibly complicated, tangled in a web of expectations, fears, and obligations. What happens when the freedom to choose feels more like the pressure to comply? So, why does this topic make us so uncomfortable? I think it's because we view eugenics as a historical monster, a villain we definitively defeated in the past. We put it on a shelf with other horrors of history, confident that it could never return. But that confidence makes us careless. We fail to see the subtle ways its logic seeps back into our modern systems. Our society is constantly ranking human beings. We do it every day. We rank people by their productivity at work, by their potential for success, by the financial cost they represent to the healthcare system or the state. The old ugly questions of eugenics aren't being asked out loud anymore. No one is explicitly saying some people are more worthy of life than others. But the question is still there. It's just implied, hidden within spreadsheets, insurance algorithms, and prenatal screening statistics. The language has changed from purity to potential, from burden to cost, but the underlying calculus is chillingly familiar. And that brings us to the real danger. The greatest misconception about eugenics is that it requires jackboots and overt hatred to take root. It doesn't. The new eugenics doesn't need villains who announce their intentions. All it needs is our indifference. It thrives in an environment where major decisions about human life are disguised as purely technical matters. When choices are presented as neutral, scientific, or just the unavoidable consequence of progress, we stop asking the hard ethical questions. We let the experts decide. We accept the logic of efficiency and risk management without considering the human cost. We've seen this movie before. History has shown us, in the most brutal and tragic ways, where this path leads. It starts with seemingly small, rational decisions, and it ends in a place we swear we will never return to. But the road to that place is paved with quiet compliance and the failure to challenge what is presented as inevitable. So I want to leave you with one final question to carry with you. If the ideas of eugenics didn't return with a thunderous roar, but crept back quietly, dressed in the sterile language of science, choice, and personal responsibility, would we even recognize it before it was too late? Would we see it for what it is, or would we just call it progress? This channel exists to examine the parts of the past we prefer to forget, because forgetting our mistakes is the surest way to repeat them. Subscribe to The Incomplete Past. History never stays buried for long. Thanks for watching. If you found this history insightful, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the ideas that have shaped our world.